In the mountain town of Pine Hollow, Colorado, the first snow hadn't yet fallen, but winter was already in the air, a quiet rehearsal of cold. The streets were hushed, porches bare, and the wind moved like a ghost through alleyways and dry leaves. Pine Hollow was the kind of town where people noticed when a curtain stayed shut too long, or when a 12-year-old boy with tired eyes wandered in, dragging his feet like he was pulling his past behind him. Luke Bennett didn't speak much anymore. Since the accident last spring, he'd stopped believing in miracles, in comfort, in the idea that anything soft could stay. His mother, Sarah, did her best to nurse with eyes that looked 10 years older than her age, but even she couldn't reach the silence he now lived in. That's when they met him. Kennel 14 at the Pine Hollow Animal Shelter didn't smell good. It didn't look like much either. But in that back corner sat a German shepherd who didn't bark, didn't whimper, just watched. One eye cloudy like a storm about to break, the other a piercing amber, focused directly on Luke. And then Luke saw it. A brass tag on the dog's weathered leather collar. Faded but still legible. If you found me, someone still believes I matter. Why would a dog no one claimed carry a message like that? Why was Luke, and only Luke, the one who noticed it? That moment sparked a quiet fire. One that would lead Luke into a story he didn't expect. A story of loss and second chances, of old secrets and new beginnings. A story that would heal a boy, bring peace to a town, and prove that sometimes the loudest love comes from silence. This is the story of a dog named Shadow. A dog who never barked, but somehow changed everything. Luke Bennett didn't want to be at the shelter. He hadn't wanted to leave the house. He hadn't wanted to talk about getting another dog. And he definitely hadn't wanted to follow his mom into that bleach-scented building filled with barking, whimpering, tail-wagging strangers. But Sarah Bennett, his mom, had reached a point of quiet desperation. Since the accident that took Luke's father 6 months ago, she'd watched her son retreat further each day, his voice growing smaller until it disappeared altogether. The once talkative, bright-eyed boy now lived in headphones and heavy silences. So when she heard about the Saturday adoption day at Pine Hollow Animal Shelter, she made a choice. A gentle push. No expectations. Just a look. The lobby was warm but dim, painted in pale yellow with posters of happy dogs and adoption success stories, pinned crookedly to the bulletin board. A woman with strong arms and a red Pine Hollow high sweatshirt greeted them, while pushing a mop across the floor. "Y'all here for the tour?" she asked, her voice practical but kind. Sarah offered a tight smile. "Just looking." Luke said nothing, hands buried deep in the sleeves of his forest green hoodie, his eyes barely lifting from the floor. "Well," the woman nodded, "name's Darlene. I'll show you around. Don't let the smell scare you, it's cleaner than it sounds." They walked past rows of kennels. Dogs of every shape and size barked, jumped, spun in frantic circles. Some whined, others pawed at the gate with desperation. Darlene made occasional comments about breed and age, but Luke barely heard them. Each dog blurred past like wallpaper in a house he didn't want to be in. Then he stopped walking. Kennel 14. At the very end of the row. A German shepherd sat there, completely still, like he'd been waiting for Luke and only Luke. He wasn't trying to be noticed. He wasn't wagging his tail or tilting his head. He didn't even stand. He just stared, one ear slightly turned, body coiled not in fear but in patience. His fur was coarse, tangled in patches of gray, cream, and black. One eye, milky and clouded, gave him a ghost-like appearance. The other eye burned gold, sharp and piercing. He looked old, worn, scarred, but not broken. Luke knelt, almost involuntarily, knees creaking against the concrete. "What's his name?" he asked softly, surprising even himself. Darlene's eyes flicked over. "Shadow. That's all it says on his tag. No chip. No paperwork. Ranger found him out by Timber Ridge about 2 months ago. Nobody's come asking." Luke didn't respond. He just leaned closer, hands resting on his thighs, mirroring the dog's still posture. Shadow didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't breathe heavy. He simply watched. "He's not scary," Luke whispered. "No," Darlene said, quieter now. "But he makes people feel something, and that tends to scare them more." Luke's gaze dropped not in fear, but focus. That's when he noticed the collar. Thick leather, cracked and darkened by time. A brass tag dangled from the front, scratched and dulled. Something about it caught the afternoon light. Luke squinted, leaned in, and read the words aloud. "If you found me, someone still believes I matter." Darlene paused. "That tag, that's the only reason he's still here. Something about it made us wait. Gave us permission not to give up just yet." Luke stared at the dog, this quiet, battered creature who didn't beg to be saved. He didn't know why, but something stirred, like a frost cracking under sunlight, like an old wound deciding to heal. Sarah approached, kneeling beside her son. "You want to meet him?" she asked gently. Luke nodded, barely. Darlene reached for her keys. "He doesn't lunge or bolt, but he walks like a man who's carried more than his share." The kennel door creaked open. Shadow rose slowly, deliberately joints stiff, but his pride intact. He walked toward Luke with no fear, no hesitation. When he stopped, it was inches from the boy's knees. Luke reached out hesitant at first, then sure, and rested his palm on the thick fur between Shadow's ears. No flinch, no growl, no bark, just warmth. Behind them, the other dogs seemed to grow quiet. Outside, the mountain sky shifted into soft gold. Sarah opened the back seat door of their car. Shadow stood at the shelter steps, unsure. "You're not heavy," Luke said quietly. "I've carried heavier." Shadow climbed in. Not like a rescue, like he was finally going home. The house on Sycamore Lane didn't make a sound when Luke and Shadow stepped through the front door. It wasn't that kind of house. It didn't creak or groan. It simply waited, like it had been holding its breath for months. Sarah dropped her keys into the ceramic bowl by the door and watched as Luke stood motionless in the entryway, his backpack still slung over one shoulder. Shadow stood beside him, tail low, eyes scanning the dim hallway like a soldier entering unfamiliar terrain. The air inside smelled like cinnamon and dust. There were traces of something older too, maybe from the apple pie Sarah had baked weeks ago but never eaten. Maybe from the dog bed in the corner of the living room that no one had dared move. Rusty's bed, the golden retriever they'd had before the accident. Shadow didn't bolt through the house like a cartoon dog finally freed. He didn't sniff frantically or explore with manic excitement. He simply stepped forward, slow and deliberate, like someone who'd lived in homes before and was trying to remember how. He passed the couch, paused at the fireplace, then turned down the hallway. Luke followed. They both stopped in front of the old dog bed, faded green fabric, still clean, still shaped like memory. Shadow circled once, twice, then lay down, like he belonged there, like he understood. From the kitchen, Sarah peeked around the corner, drying her hands with a towel. "He found Rusty's spot," she said softly. Luke didn't answer. He just stepped out of his sneakers, set down his bag, and sat cross-legged beside the bed. Shadow didn't lift his head, but his tail thumped once. Just once. That evening, Sarah made spaghetti, out of habit more than appetite. Luke only picked at his plate. Shadow didn't beg, didn't whine. He just lay beneath the table, still and warm. When a slice of garlic bread slipped off Sarah's plate and hit the floor, Shadow sniffed it and looked away. "That's unexpected," Sarah said. "Most dogs would have inhaled it." "He's polite," Luke murmured. Later that night, when Sarah finished the dishes, she glanced out the kitchen window and paused. Luke was sitting in the backyard, in the drizzle, not under the porch, not in the dry spot, just sitting in the grass. Shadow was beside him, their silhouettes nearly touching. Both of them looking out at something invisible. Both still. Both quiet. The next morning, Luke woke early. No alarm. Just instinct. Downstairs, Shadow was already waiting by the back door. Not pacing. Not barking. Just there. Luke grabbed a slice of toast and sat beside him. "You want to go out?" Shadow didn't wag his tail, but his head gave a tiny nod. Almost human. They walked slowly down Sycamore Lane. Frost clung to the mailbox edges. The air smelled like wet pine and chimney smoke. Shadow didn't pull on the leash. He didn't rush. He matched Luke's pace, a careful, steady rhythm that said he wasn't going anywhere fast. At the corner, they passed Mrs. Donnelly's house, the one with the blue wind chimes and flower pots full of frostbitten herbs. She was already on her porch in her cardigan, hands wrapped around a steaming mug. When she saw them, she raised a hand. "Well, I'll be," she called. "Is that your dog now, sweetheart?" Luke nodded. "His name's Shadow." Mrs. Donnelly squinted. "He looks like one of those military dogs. Strong. Watchful. Good bones." Shadow stood still, ears forward but relaxed. Then she tilted her head. "You be good to that one," she said. "He's seen things. I can tell." They passed a group of boys from Luke's school near the elementary playground. One of them, lanky, sweatshirt sleeves covering half his hands, pointed and laughed. "Yo, Parker, that a police reject?" Luke kept walking. Shadow didn't react, but his body tensed. Just slightly. Luke felt it in the leash, not aggression. Not fear. just alert. At home, Luke dropped his bag by the stairs, climbed onto his bed, and stared at the ceiling. Shadow came in moments later, and curled up on the rug near the window. Quiet. Familiar. Luke turned to face him. You don't care what they say, huh? Shadow blinked once, then yawned. That night, Luke pulled out the journal he hadn't touched since Rusty died. Most pages were blank. He opened to a new one, and wrote, November 1st, Shadow doesn't bark. Doesn't do tricks. Doesn't chase. He just stays. That's enough. The storm came 2 nights later. Not loud. Just cold. The kind that slips under doors and settles in your bones. Sarah was working a night shift. Luke sat on the floor of his room, blanket over his shoulders, a lamp casting soft light against the walls. Shadow was beside him, coiled like a question mark. Luke opened his sketchbook. He'd started drawing again, mostly dogs. Some imagined, some from memory. One showed Shadow beneath a pine tree. Another had the two of them, sitting side by side, looking toward a distant mountain that wasn't drawn yet. None of the sketches had faces. Just shapes. And shadows. He glanced over at the collar he had taken off earlier to brush Shadow's tangled fur. The brass tag caught the lamplight, dull but still golden. Luke turned it over. He hadn't noticed the back before. The surface was grimy, oxidized, but under the grime, something faint. He squinted. Scratches. Letters. An address? Heart beating faster, Luke fetched an old toothbrush, dipped it in soapy water, and scrubbed gently. After a few minutes, the brass tag revealed more than it had ever offered before. 144 Granger Trail. Luke stared at it, frozen. That was real. A street at the far end of town, just past the last row of houses. He looked at Shadow, who had lifted his head now, quietly watching. You didn't come from nowhere, Luke whispered. Someone loved you once. Shadow blinked once, then laid his head down again. Luke almost went the next morning. He had his boots on, backpack packed with a flashlight and a granola bar. The brass tag, now clean, gleaming faintly, sat in his pocket, its weight heavier than the metal it was made of. He stood at the front door with the leash in hand, Shadow sitting patiently beside him. The sky outside hung low and gray, the kind of November morning where nothing cast a shadow, because the sun never fully showed up. Then came his mom's voice from the kitchen. Don't forget, Willow Pines today. Luke blinked. Right. You still coming? Yeah, he mumbled, slipping the leash back onto the hook. Shadow didn't whine, didn't resist. He just sat, waiting. Willow Pines was the local senior center tucked between a post office and a row of rusted mailboxes. The hedges out front were trimmed to low, careful shapes, and the brick walkway smelled faintly of lavender and toast. Sarah had started volunteering there on weekends. Blood pressure checks, conversation, vitals. Lately, she brought Luke with her. Not to work, just to sit, to be around people without pressure to talk. Nobody expected anything of him there, and he liked that. Today he brought Shadow. It started as a simple curiosity. Would they let the dog in? They did, and the reaction was instant. An elderly man in a cardigan whistled low. Now that's a real dog. Another woman smiled wide, tapping her friend's arm to look. But one woman didn't smile. She sat by the window, a green and yellow crocheted blanket over her lap, her silver hair tied into a low bun. Her eyes followed Shadow the second he entered. She didn't wave, didn't move, just watched. As Luke passed by her, he heard her whisper, not to him, not to anyone in particular. I've seen those eyes before. Luke paused, turned. Ma'am. She still didn't look at him. Not exactly, but close. Like déjà vu. In fur. Luke waited. Could have been a year ago. Could have been 10. I forget time. But not a dog like that. One that listens like he hears ghosts. Shadow stood still, ears flicking once, then settling. Luke didn't know what to say. He just nodded, and walked on. But the words stuck to him like mist on a windshield. That night, Luke opened his journal again. November 4th. Someone else remembers Shadow. That makes 2 of us now. I have to know who he was. And what happened. I have to go to Granger Trail. The next morning, the sky over Pine Hollow was the color of dirty snow. The wind rattled the porch light. The trees stood like bare-boned statues. Sarah was in the kitchen, sipping coffee from her chipped mug, dressed in scrubs and tired eyes. Luke adjusted his hoodie and slung on his backpack. Shadow sat by the door ready. Sarah glanced at them. Don't go too far. I won't. And take your phone. Luke nodded. He wasn't lying. He just didn't know how to explain what he was looking for. Not yet. They walked beyond the familiar blocks of Pine Hollow, where sidewalks gave way to gravel and then dirt. Mailboxes leaned like tired shoulders. Paint peeled from porch rails. Wind chimes clinked without music. After 20 minutes, Luke saw it. The street sign was barely there. Granger Trail, hand-painted letters now faded. At the end of a leaf-covered driveway sat a two-story cabin, once green, now mostly gray. Paint peeled like old bark. The screen door hung slightly ajar. A porch swing creaked in the breeze. Shadow paused. Not in hesitation, but in recognition. Then he moved. Not fast. Not afraid. Just forward. Luke followed, heart drumming louder than his footsteps. When they reached the porch, the door opened with a groan. A tall man stood there, lean, weathered, with eyes like frost and hands that trembled slightly as he gripped the frame. His clothes were clean but old, flannel shirt tucked into worn jeans, boots unlaced. He didn't speak right away. Then he looked down at the dog. His mouth parted. A breath caught. "Juno?" Shadow froze. Then stepped forward. The man dropped to one knee, voice breaking. "My God, it's really you." He wrapped his arms around Shadow's neck, head bowed. Shadow leaned in. No tail wag. No bark. Just stillness. Luke stood frozen, unsure whether to move or retreat. The man looked up at last, his eyes red at the edges but shining. "You found him at the shelter?" Luke nodded. The man reached out a hand. "Name's Walter Granger." Luke shook it. "I'm Luke." Walter glanced at the brass tag Luke now held out. He took it carefully, turning it over. Ran his thumb across the words. "I had that made years ago. For my daughter." He gestured toward the porch chairs. "Come in, son." Inside, the cabin smelled like cedar and old citrus polish. The fireplace hadn't been lit in a while, but it didn't feel cold. On the mantel, a photo sat between two hand-carved wooden dogs. A young woman, maybe mid-20s, long auburn hair, kneeling beside a German shepherd puppy. "That's Emma," Walter said, lowering himself into a chair. "And that's Juno, first day she brought him home." He exhaled slowly. "She had a heart condition. We knew early on. Lived with it for 28 years. He looked at Shadow. He was her shadow. Always was. Slept by her side. Once woke me when she fainted in the hallway. Luke listened without speaking. "She passed 3 years ago. After that, I tried to take care of him. I did. But I fell apart." He kept looking for her, sitting by the door every night. Walter's voice broke. "One morning, I left the gate open, and I let him go. Didn't chase him. Couldn't." He pulled open a drawer beside the chair. Inside was a faded envelope. He handed it to Luke. "Wrote this for whoever might find him. Never had the guts to take it to the shelter." Luke opened the note. The handwriting was soft, slightly slanted. "If he ever finds someone new, tell him he still matters." Luke blinked hard. Shadow now lay curled at Walter's feet, exactly as he had in the photo. When the sky outside began to dim, Luke stood. "I should take him home." Walter nodded. "He has a home again. I can see it in how he looks at you." Luke hesitated. "Do you want him back?" Walter smiled. Sad. Grateful. "No. He's exactly where he's supposed to be." As Luke and Shadow walked back through the forest road, the tag in his pocket no longer felt mysterious. It felt like a torch, passed from one broken heart to another, and lit again. Back home, Luke tucked the photo of Emma and Juno into the front flap of his sketchbook. He didn't show it to his mom. Not yet. Some things felt like they needed to stay quiet for a while, like a flame that could be smothered if touched too soon. Shadow rested beside his bed, curled in that same question mark shape, breathing slow and steady. For the first time in a long time, Luke slept without dreaming. The next Saturday, Luke found himself standing in the Pine Hollow Library, a modest brick building nestled between the barber shop and a bakery that always smelled like cinnamon rolls. He hadn't planned to go in, but something had pulled him there, the same way a quiet voice sometimes says, "This is the next step." Inside, the place smelled like old paper and vanilla coffee. A bulletin board near the front desk caught his eye, reading Friends, Saturdays at 11. Children welcome. Dogs encouraged. Behind the desk stood Ms. Langley, short gray curls, glasses perched at the tip of her nose, and a shawl with embroidered cats wrapped around her shoulders. Luke cleared his throat. "Do you still need dogs for that program?" Ms. Langley peered over her glasses. "For reading Friends?" "Always." She looked past him at Shadow, who sat by the doorway, ears alert, gaze soft. "He doesn't bark," Luke said. "He just stays." Ms. Langley smiled. "Perfect. That morning, the reading corner filled with noise. Kids between 5 and 10 tumbled in with parents, backpacks, and crumpled books. Some were shy, some loud. One brought a stuffed elephant for bravery. Shadow didn't flinch. He chose a spot on the rug near a shelf labeled Dog Tales, and lay down like he'd done it 100 times. The first boy stumbled through Curious George, tripping over Mischievous. A girl read the first half of Goodnight Moon before growing quiet. Then came a small voice. Emma Ray. She was tiny for 7, glasses too big for her face, jacket covered in stitched stars. She held her book like it might break. She sat beside Shadow, open to the first page. Her lips moved. No sound. Shadow didn't move. He didn't look away. He simply stayed. Present. Patient. Emma Ray tried again. A whisper. Then another. The cat sat. She faltered. Looked up. Shadow's eyes were half closed, body still and calm. No judgment. Just space. On the mat. She finished the sentence. Then another. By the time she reached the end of the page, Shadow had rested his chin on her boot. She smiled. A real one. From across the room, Luke watched something loosen in his chest, not pride exactly. Something deeper. Something like peace. After the session, Ms. Langley came over, her eyes damp behind her glasses. That little girl hasn't read aloud in 2 months, she whispered. Whatever he's doing, don't stop. Luke looked at Shadow. I think he just listens. Word spread. The following Saturday, more children came. Shadow became the dog who didn't bark, but always stayed. Parents watched from the sidelines. Some wiped their eyes. One man knelt beside Luke after his son read a full story without stuttering for the first time. He stayed with him the whole time, the father whispered. Like he knew. Luke didn't know what to say. So he just nodded. A few days later, as Luke walked home from school, Ms. Langley called him from the library steps. Someone wants to talk to you. Standing beside her was a woman with shoulder-length chestnut hair, a pale blue peacoat, and a camera bag slung over one shoulder. Rachel Keene, she said, holding out a hand. Local reporter. I write for the Pine Hollow Gazette. I heard about a quiet boy and a quieter dog changing how this town listens. Luke blinked. I'd like to write about him, she continued. And about you. He hesitated, then nodded. They sat on the library steps while Rachel scribbled in a small notepad. She asked about the shelter, the brass tag, the program at Willow Pines. Luke told her what he could, skipping the parts that felt too personal. Some things were just between a boy, a tree, and a dog who never barked. Rachel thanked him and snapped a photo before she left, Shadow sitting beside Luke, Emma Ray leaning into Shadow as she turned a page. A week later, the article ran on the front page. The Dog Who Listens. The subheading read, How One Silent Companion Helped a Town Find Its Voice Again. Beneath it was the photo, Shadow's head resting on Emma Ray's boot, her mouth mid-sentence, Luke watching with quiet reverence. Ms. Langley had it printed, framed, and placed near the front desk. A small brass plaque underneath read, To those who hear without sound. When Luke saw it, he didn't speak. He didn't need to. But that night, he did something new. He carved. Using a piece of wood from the branch that had fallen from the maple tree in their backyard, the one where Shadow liked to lie, he cut a simple rectangle. With the tip of his compass, he etched, Shadow doesn't bark. He listens. And that's louder. He looped twine through the top and clipped it to his backpack zipper. It was small, but it felt like a flag. The next day, Sarah noticed it as he left for school. What's that? She asked. Luke looked back. Shadow's quote. Then he opened the door. Shadow trotted ahead. Still silent. Still steady. But somehow louder than ever. The snow arrived late that year. Not as a storm, but as a hush. One morning, Pine Hollow woke beneath a soft white veil. The rooftops wore it like crowns. Tree limbs held it like open hands. It didn't roar or sting. It whispered, a lullaby in flakes. Luke watched it fall from his bedroom window, breath fogging the glass. On the wall beside his desk hung his growing shadow wall, photos, drawings, scribbled notes. Each one a quiet story. Each one a person Shadow had touched. At the center of it all was the wooden tag Luke had carved weeks earlier. Shadow doesn't bark. He listens. And that's louder. That morning, as he poured cereal into a chipped bowl, Sarah called from the kitchen doorway. You've got an email. He looked up. Her face was unreadable, but her voice held something between pride and wonder. It's from the Civic Hall. Luke patted over in his socks. The subject line made him blink twice. Therapy Animal Recognition Ceremony. Invitation to speak. Shadow had been nominated. By Ms. Langley. By the parents from Reading Friends. By a few residents at Willow Pines. They didn't just want to honor him. They wanted Luke to speak. At first, he said nothing. Then he looked at Shadow, lying by the heater, tail thumping once against the wood floor. "I'll do it," Luke whispered. Sarah's brow lifted. "You sure?" He nodded. And meant it. The Pine Hollow Civic Hall used to be a train station, red brick, arched windows, wooden beams overhead. Now it served as a space for town meetings, winter fairs, and school plays. On the evening of the ceremony, it glowed with string lights and warm cider. Folding chairs lined the hall in neat rows. A small stage stood under a banner that read, "To those who comfort." Luke wore a navy sweater. Shadow wore nothing, not even a bandana. He didn't need one. He walked beside Luke through the double doors like a soldier returning home. A hush followed them. Whispers. "That's him. The library dog. Is that the boy who found him?" A woman near the cider table pressed a hand to her heart. Shadow didn't react. He simply lay beside Luke's chair, ears relaxed. Watching. Listening. The ceremony began with short speeches. A cat named Pickles who purred beside cancer patients. A golden retriever who visited children's hospitals. A miniature horse named Penny. Each was met with warm applause. Then came the final moment. A tall woman in a gray blazer stepped up to the podium. Her name was Marcia Keene. Event organizer. Calm voice. Kind eyes. "Our final recognition tonight," she said, "isn't for tricks or training. It's for presence. For stillness. For a dog who says nothing, but speaks to everyone." She turned slightly. "Luke Bennett and Shadow, would you come up?" Luke stood. His knees trembled. His palms were cold. Shadow rose too, pacing him. Together, they walked toward the stage. The room was quiet, not the kind of silence that waits, but the kind that listens. Luke stepped up to the mic, took a breath, then began. He was rejected. His voice cracked. But he didn't stop. Left behind. Wandering. No name. No chip. Just a tag. He reached into his pocket, held it up. "If you found me, someone still believes I matter." Luke looked down at Shadow, who sat like stone beside him. He didn't bark. Didn't chase. Didn't ask for anything. He paused. But he stayed. His eyes scanned the room, dozens of faces, some teary, all still. "I used to be scared to talk. Couldn't find the words. Couldn't feel the words." He swallowed. "But Shadow taught me, you don't have to be loud to be heard. Sometimes being there, just being, is enough." Silence. Then a single clap. Then another. Then a wave. The sound rose like a tide and folded over them, warm and full and real. Luke didn't look for approval. He looked at Shadow, who blinked, as if to say, "I'm right here." After the ceremony, people came in soft clusters. A little girl from Reading Friends hugged Shadow tight and whispered, "Thank you for sitting with me." An older man held Luke's hand and said, "He was there when my wife passed. Never moved. Just stayed." Ms. Langley brought over a printed copy of the Gazette article, now framed. She smiled through tears. "You did good, both of you." In the corner of the room, Luke spotted a figure standing near the exit. Flannel coat. Gray beard. Quiet eyes. Walter. He didn't step forward. But when Luke turned back to the gift table, a small cream envelope had appeared among the others. The handwriting was familiar. "Thank you for letting Juno be seen again." Luke pressed it to his chest. Just for a moment. Then tucked it away. That night, Pine Hollow glowed like a snow globe. Light flurries drifted across quiet sidewalks. Porch lights flickered like stars. The streets were still, but not empty. Luke and Shadow walked home side by side. At the corner of Sycamore and Maple, Luke paused beneath the old tree. Shadow leaned against his leg, just slightly. "You did good," Luke whispered. "No bark. No sound. Just presence. Just peace." The frost came quietly. No warning. No fanfare. Just one morning, it was there, lining the rooftops in silver lace, turning porch steps slick and hollow-sounding underfoot. The maple tree in the Bennett backyard stood like a sentinel, its bare limbs stretching toward the pale winter sky. Shadow had taken to resting beneath it, not just once or twice, every afternoon. He'd curl near the roots, nose tucked to tail, as if listening to something beneath the soil. Luke would join him sometimes, wrapped in a blanket, sketchbook resting on his knees. Other times, they said nothing at all. They didn't need to. It wasn't silence. It was understanding without sound. One afternoon, Luke stood beside the tree and looked up, really looked. The branches reminded him of veins, of old roads on a wrinkled map. He turned, went inside, and returned with thumbtacks, string, and a stack of pages. He began building something new on the wall above his desk. He pinned photos, Emma Ray reading beside Shadow. The framed article from the Gazette. A thank you card from Ms. Langley with 3 little paw prints drawn in red ink. He pinned notes, scribbled quotes from kids, sketches of Shadow beneath pines, Walter's letter, and the brass tag. In the middle, he placed a hand-lettered sign. The Wall of Shadow. Each piece wasn't just a memory. It was proof that presence could heal, that listening could change lives, that staying mattered. People began to notice. First came Lydia, the same reporter who'd written the original article. She reached out again, said she was working on a follow-up, wanted to see what happened after the applause. She arrived on a Tuesday, soft snow flurries brushing her coat as she stepped out of her car, camera bag across her shoulder. I heard from Ms. Langley again, she said to Luke. She told me about the wall. I had to come. Luke led her inside. She took pictures. Of the drawings. Of the tag. Of Shadow, curled beneath the window like a permanent fixture. You know, she said softly, lowering her camera, I've covered therapy dogs for years. But this? She trailed off. This is different. The next week, the follow-up article ran in the Pine Hollow Gazette. The Dog Who Stayed. A story not about tricks or certificates, but about stillness. About presence. About a boy who forgot how to speak, and the dog who reminded him he never had to. Winter deepened. The snow didn't fall in storms, it fell in layers. Quiet. Gentle. Like the town was being wrapped in wool. Shadow walked slower now. Not limping. Just deliberate. As if every step was a choice. One Sunday, Luke found him already curled beneath the maple, watching birds scatter along the fence line. Luke joined him, bringing nothing this time. No sketchbook. No journal. Just himself. They sat until the sky turned to cotton. The next morning, the world was unusually still. Luke woke early. Shadow wasn't at the door like usual. He padded downstairs in socks, called softly. No answer. He stepped into the backyard. Shadow lay under the maple, curled into his usual shape. Peaceful. Still. But not breathing. Luke didn't cry at first. He knelt. Placed his hand over the thick fur. No rise. No fall. Just warmth, fading slowly. The wind moved through the branches, gentle and low. Sarah came out a moment later. She saw. She didn't ask. She just wrapped her arms around Luke and held him there, her forehead resting against his temple. Later that day, Walter arrived. Same flannel coat. Same slow steps. He looked at Shadow, and then at Luke and nodded. Grief had softened in him now. Not sharp. Just familiar. Together, they chose the spot beneath the maple. Walter brought an old spade from his truck, but Luke did most of the digging. Each scoop was careful, deliberate, like turning pages in a book you didn't want to finish. Shadow was wrapped in the blue blanket that used to live on Luke's reading chair. Sarah had washed it that morning, without being asked. When the last of the earth was returned, Walter handed Luke a smooth, flat stone, pale, etched by hand. 2 lines. If you found me, someone still believes I matter. And now so do they. The words shimmered in the winter light. People began arriving. Emma Ray came first, holding her favorite book. She knelt beside the grave and read aloud, voice clear, soft. She didn't cry. She just read. Ms. Langley stood behind her, eyes rimmed red, clutching the framed photo from the library. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Then came Earl, Walter's friend from Willow Pines, holding a small watercolor. Shadow under the maple, eyes turned toward someone just out of frame. He pressed it into Luke's hands. Thank you, he whispered. The last person to arrive was a quiet man in a navy coat, holding a copy of the Gazette and a camera bag slung over his shoulder. He didn't introduce himself. He just stood, head bowed, listening. Some people left flowers. Some left notes. Others placed a hand on the stone and let silence speak for them. That night, Luke sat in his room, the air heavy with stillness. On his desk sat a new bundle, his journal, now printed and stapled by Ms. Langley. She'd placed a stack in the children's section of the library. She called it, The Dog Who Stayed Still. They were gone within a week. Time didn't rush after that. It moved the way it always had. In seasons. In size. In small, ordinary miracles. Then came Lucky. Not planned. Just waiting. Sarah found him in the adoption corner at the clinic, small, brown, comically long-eared. Eyes too big for his head. Tail with a slight kink. Luke raised an eyebrow. He looks like a loaf of bread. But Lucky followed him everywhere. Not in Shadow's quiet footsteps. More like a tumble. Bouncing. Licking. Spinning in clumsy joy. One Saturday, Luke brought Lucky to the library. He didn't stay still. He sneezed on a bookmark. Knocked over a stack of books, chasing a squeaky mouse. Emma Ray laughed so hard she snorted. Ms. Langley shook her head, but smiled. Luke watched it happen. The same warmth. The same moment. When someone felt seen. That night, he opened a fresh page. April 3rd. Lucky doesn't sit still. But maybe, just maybe, he listens too. Not every miracle makes noise. Sometimes it walks beside you on 4 quiet paws. Sometimes it waits beneath a tree, curled into the shape of a question you didn't know you needed to ask. Shadow didn't do tricks. He didn't bark or beg or try to be anything other than himself. But he changed people. He gave a frightened girl her first sentence out loud. He gave a grieving man permission to forgive himself. He gave a boy who forgot how to speak the courage to say, "I matter too." He listened. That was his gift. And maybe that's what the world needs more of. Not louder voices, but deeper presence. Because sometimes the most powerful kind of love doesn't shout. It doesn't announce itself or demand to be seen. It just stays. Steady. Quiet. Real. And if you're lucky enough to find that kind of love in a dog, a person, or a moment beneath a maple tree, then hold on to it. Because love like that doesn't need to be loud to last forever. Sometimes the right story finds you when you're ready to hear it. Maybe you've loved a dog like Shadow. Maybe you've been the quiet one waiting for someone to listen. If this story touched your heart, even just a little, share it with someone who needs a reminder today. Leave us a comment below, tell us where you're watching from, or share your own story of healing, of hope, of quiet love. And if you believe, like we do, that God sends signs in the softest moments, then type Amen in the comments. Because someone out there may be scrolling past, and your words might be the reason they stay a little longer. If you'd like more real stories like this, stories that don't shout, but still speak deeply, click subscribe and turn on notifications. We'll be right here, quietly waiting, just like Shadow did.